What if the greatest threat to your family isn't it the sin everyone talks about? What if it isn't the scandalous failure that makes headlines, the obvious vice that pastors warn about from the pulpit, or the temptation that instantly triggers alarm bells in your conscience? What if the real danger is something so common, so normalized, and so deeply woven into modern life that most people never question it at all? Because according to one priest who has spent decades studying spiritual warfare from the front lines, the very thing tearing families apart may be sitting quietly at your dinner table right now. It may already be shaping your marriage. It may already be shaping your children. And by the time most people recognize the damage, the consequences have already spread into the next generation. For years, people have assumed that the collapse of families begins with dramatic sins. They point to infidelity, addiction, pornography, or outright abandonment. And certainly those things cause destruction. But there is a reason we recognize those dangers immediately. They are obvious. They announce themselves. They leave visible wreckage behind. Yet the most effective attacks rarely begin with explosions. They begin with small compromises that appear harmless because they arrive disguised as something reasonable. And that is precisely why they are so difficult to fight. Imagine a fortress built to withstand every known assault. Massive walls, strong gates, watchful guards. If an enemy wanted to conquer it, charging directly through the front entrance would be foolish. Instead, the enemy would search for a crack, a weakness, a neglected section of the wall, something small enough to ignore but significant enough to exploit. And once that crack was found, pressure could be applied slowly, patiently, and relentlessly until the entire structure began collapsing from within. According to Father Chad Ripperger, that is exactly how spiritual attacks work. The destruction of a family rarely begins with catastrophic evil. It begins with disorder. It begins with confusion. It begins when the structure God designed for the family starts to weaken. And the unsettling part is that many people today have been trained to celebrate the very attitudes that create that weakness. Before we go any further, it's important to understand why this matters. Because modern culture often treats the family as little more than a social arrangement, a collection of individuals living under the same roof, a practical solution for companionship, finances, or raising children. But throughout Christian history, the family was understood as something far more significant. It was viewed as the first school of virtue, the first church, the place where souls learned how to understand authority, sacrifice, love, forgiveness, and ultimately, God Himself. That means when the family functions properly, it becomes one of the strongest forces for spiritual formation that exists. But it also means that when the family becomes disordered, the consequences reach far beyond daily stress or occasional conflict. They shape the entire trajectory of future generations. And that brings us to a disturbing question. If families possess that much power, why do so many of them seem fragile today? Why are anxiety, resentment, division, loneliness, and spiritual confusion becoming increasingly common inside households that appear healthy from the outside? Why are so many parents exhausted? Why are so many marriages strained? Why are so many children walking away from the faith they were raised in? The easy answer would be to blame technology, or politics, or education, or social media. And while all of those factors play a role, Father Ripperger argues that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Something that predates every modern trend by thousands of years. To understand it, we have to go back to the beginning. The story starts in Genesis, but not in the way most people expect. When people discuss Adam and Eve, attention usually focuses on the forbidden fruit, the temptation, the serpent, the act of disobedience itself. But there is another detail hidden inside the story that often receives less attention. A detail that may reveal something profound about the nature of family breakdown. After the fall occurs, God calls out to Adam, "Where are you?" At first glance, it seems like a simple question. But according to many theologians, the question carries enormous significance, because God already knew where Adam was. The question wasn't asked to gather information. It was asked to reveal responsibility. Adam had been entrusted with something. He had been given a role, a duty, a vocation. And in the critical moment, he failed to fulfill it. That failure would become more than an isolated event. It would become a pattern repeated throughout human history. Because one of the deepest wounds left by the fall, according to traditional Christian thought, is a tendency toward spiritual passivity. A tendency to avoid responsibility when responsibility becomes costly. A tendency to retreat from leadership when leadership demands sacrifice. At first, that may sound abstract. But think about how often this pattern appears. Difficult conversations get postponed. Important decisions get avoided. Spiritual responsibilities get delegated. Problems are ignored until they become crises. The path of least resistance slowly becomes the default setting. And because these choices often seem small, they rarely trigger alarm. Yet over time they create a vacuum, and nature hates vacuums. When responsibility is abandoned, someone else inevitably steps in to carry it. That's where the story becomes even more interesting, because when a vacuum forms inside a family, the consequences extend far beyond practical matters. The emotional balance of the household changes. The spiritual atmosphere changes. Relationships change. Expectations change. And perhaps most importantly, children notice. Even when they cannot explain it, children are remarkably sensitive to the environment around them. They absorb tensions adults think are hidden. They recognize inconsistencies adults assume are invisible. They learn not merely from what parents say, but from what parents embody. A father can tell his children that faith matters, but if faith never influences his actions, children notice. A father can insist that prayer is important, but if prayer always feels optional to him, children notice. A father can preach conviction, but if he lives with indifference, children notice. And that creates a contradiction. The dangerous thing about contradictions is that they rarely produce rebellion immediately. Instead, they create confusion. They plant questions that continue growing for years. Why should I believe this if the people teaching it don't seem transformed by it? Why should I sacrifice for something that appears unimportant to them? Why should I dedicate my life to truths that never seemed important enough to shape theirs? Those questions often remain silent for a long time, until one day they aren't. And by then, the damage has already spread. This is why Father Ripperger argues that spiritual passivity is not merely a personality trait. It is not merely a weakness. It is a doorway, not because passive people are evil, not because they intend harm, but because every vacuum eventually gets filled by something else. and what fills that vacuum is rarely neutral. At this point, many people expect the discussion to become harsh or accusatory. But Father Ripperger repeatedly emphasizes that understanding the problem is not the same thing as assigning blame. Because when order breaks down inside a family, everyone suffers. The husband suffers, the wife suffers, the children suffer, the entire household feels the pressure. Consider what often happens when one parent stops carrying responsibility. The other parent begins carrying more, then even more. What begins as assistance gradually becomes burden. What begins as support gradually becomes exhaustion. And what begins as patience gradually becomes resentment. The tragedy is that many families never recognize this transition while it is happening. They simply adapt. The wife becomes overwhelmed. The husband becomes increasingly detached. The children absorb the tension. And everyone assumes the problem is stress, or schedules, or finances, or personality differences. Anything except the deeper disorder creating those symptoms. But according to Father Ripperger, symptoms are rarely the root cause. They are warnings, signals, evidence that something foundational has shifted. And once that shift occurs, a predictable chain reaction begins. First comes spiritual neglect. Prayer becomes inconsistent. Faith becomes routine. Sacraments become obligations rather than encounters. Then comes emotional distance. Conversations become functional instead of meaningful. Relationships become transactional. People begin living beside one another rather than with one another. Then comes fragmentation. Each family member retreats into separate worlds, separate schedules, separate concerns, separate priorities. The household remains intact physically. But spiritually and emotionally, it begins drifting apart. This is why some families appear successful while quietly falling apart. The bills are paid. The grades are good. The vacations look impressive. The social media photos seem perfect. Yet beneath the surface, something essential is missing. Something difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. A sense of unity, a sense of mission, a sense that everyone is moving toward the same destination. Without that shared purpose, families often become collections of individuals pursuing separate goals under the same roof. And when challenges arrive, as they always do, there is no deeper foundation holding everyone together. This is where Father Ripperger's observations become especially striking. Because throughout years of ministry, he repeatedly encountered families who were technically religious but spiritually weak. Families that attended church. Families that identified strongly with their faith. Families that looked committed from the outside. Yet when serious trials arrived, their foundations crumbled almost immediately. Why? Because external participation is not the same thing as internal transformation. Faith cannot survive indefinitely as a cultural habit. Eventually, it must become personal. It must become real. It must become costly. And that process usually begins with leadership. Not perfect leadership, not flawless leadership, but intentional leadership. The kind that accepts responsibility. The kind that embraces sacrifice. The kind that acts even when action feels uncomfortable. Unfortunately, modern culture often sends the opposite message. It teaches people to prioritize comfort, avoid conflict, protect personal convenience, minimize sacrifice, pursue self-fulfillment above all else. At first, Those ideas sound attractive. Who doesn't want comfort? Who doesn't want convenience? Who doesn't want fulfillment? But there is a hidden cost. Because the qualities that sustain strong families are rarely comfortable. Patience isn't comfortable. Forgiveness isn't comfortable. Discipline isn't comfortable. Responsibility isn't comfortable. Leadership certainly isn't comfortable. The very things required to strengthen a family are often the things modern culture encourages people to avoid. And that creates a collision. A collision between what feels good in the moment and what produces strength over time. Most people never realize they are choosing between those two paths. They simply follow the easier option. One compromise at a time, one avoidance at a time, one delay at a time, until eventually they wake up wondering how things became so fractured. And according to Father Ripperger, that moment of realization often arrives far later than people expect. Because family breakdown is rarely sudden, it is gradual. It unfolds quietly, almost invisibly, until the consequences become impossible to ignore. The frightening part is that by the time many families recognize the pattern, they are already deep inside it. The good news is that recognition creates opportunity, because identifying the problem is the first step toward reversing it. But before any restoration can begin, there is something even more important that must be understood. If spiritual passivity creates the opening, what exactly enters through that opening? What happens after the vacuum forms? What are the specific strategies that exploit it? And why does the pattern seem so consistent across families separated by different backgrounds, different cultures, and different generations? According to Father Ripperger, the answer reveals a blueprint so predictable that once you see it, you may never look at family struggles the same way again. And that blueprint begins with 3 stages that almost nobody notices until it is already too late. The blueprint begins with a reality that most families never recognize, because it doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives with silence. According to Father Ripperger, every major collapse follows a sequence, and the first stage is almost always the same. The voice that should provide direction slowly becomes quieter. The person who should establish spiritual priorities becomes distracted. Responsibilities are postponed. Difficult conversations are avoided. And little by little, leadership is replaced by convenience. At first, nobody notices because life continues moving forward. The bills are paid. The schedules are managed. The family still appears functional. But beneath the surface, something crucial has changed. The center is no longer holding. And because that change happens gradually, people adapt to it rather than confront it. Yet, every adaptation creates a new weakness, and every weakness creates a new opportunity for disorder to spread. Once that foundation begins to weaken, the second stage emerges. The burden that should have been shared starts falling onto fewer shoulders. One person begins compensating for everyone else. More responsibilities are accepted. More pressure is absorbed. More emotional weight is carried. From the outside, this often looks like strength. It looks admirable. It looks responsible. But there is a hidden danger inside constant overextension. Exhaustion eventually changes people. It changes how they think, how they react, and how they relate to those around them. Patience becomes harder. Joy becomes rarer. Small frustrations become major conflicts. And because nobody understands the deeper cause, Everyone focuses on the symptoms instead of the source. But the most important stage comes next, because this is where generational consequences begin. Children learn from the environment surrounding them. They study examples more carefully than instructions. They notice whether faith feels alive or mechanical. They notice whether values are practiced or merely discussed. They notice whether sacrifice is real or symbolic. And when they repeatedly witness contradictions, something subtle happens. Trust begins to erode. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly. Gradually. One unanswered question at a time. One disappointment at a time. One inconsistency at a time. Eventually, the foundation they inherited no longer feels convincing. And when challenges arrive later in life, they have nothing solid to stand on. This is why Father Ripperger repeatedly emphasizes that family breakdown is rarely about a single catastrophic event. It is about patterns, repeated choices, habits that slowly become culture. Because culture inside a family is not created by declarations. It is created by repetition. Whatever happens consistently becomes normal. Whatever becomes normal eventually shapes identity. And whatever shapes identity influences future generations. That means every family is constantly teaching something, even when nobody realizes a lesson is being taught. Now here is where the story becomes hopeful, because recognizing a pattern means the pattern can be interrupted. The same principle that allows disorder to spread also allows restoration to spread. Just as small compromises accumulate over time, small acts of faithfulness accumulate too. One prayer may seem insignificant. One conversation may seem insignificant. One decision to take responsibility may seem insignificant. But families are transformed through accumulation. The future is built one choice at a time, and every meaningful change begins when someone decides the cycle ends with them. That is why Father Ripperger argues that genuine renewal never begins with programs, strategies, or motivational speeches. It begins with conversion, not theoretical conversion, not emotional conversion, practical conversion. The kind that changes behavior, the kind that changes priorities, the kind that costs something. Because every great transformation throughout history required someone willing to act before seeing immediate results. Someone willing to choose discipline before comfort. Someone willing to choose responsibility before convenience. Someone willing to choose sacrifice before applause. Imagine a family where prayer becomes a daily reality rather than an occasional event. Imagine a home where faith is visible in ordinary decisions rather than limited to special occasions. Imagine children growing up watching adults take spiritual responsibility seriously. Imagine conversations about truth, virtue, purpose, and eternity becoming normal instead of rare. Those changes may appear small from day to day, but their long-term impact is enormous. Over years, they reshape expectations. Over decades, they reshape families. Over generations, they reshape entire communities. And this is where Father Ripperger's warning becomes inseparable from his message of hope. Because if disorder can travel through generations, so can faithfulness. If weakness can influence the future, strength can influence the future as well. Every family inherits something from the past. Some inherit blessings. Some inherit wounds. Most inherit a mixture of both. But inheritance does not determine destiny. Every generation receives an opportunity to either continue a pattern or transform it. The question is whether anyone is willing to make that choice. The reason this matters so much is because modern culture constantly encourages people to think only about the present moment. Immediate satisfaction, immediate comfort, immediate happiness. Yet the strongest families think differently. They think in generations. They understand that today's actions become tomorrow's legacy. They understand that children inherit more than possessions. They inherit habits, perspectives, values, priorities. They inherit examples. And examples often speak louder than words. That realization can feel overwhelming at first. It can even create guilt. Many people will hear this message and immediately think about missed opportunities, mistakes they regret, responsibilities they avoided, or years they wish they could reclaim. But dwelling on regret changes nothing. What matters is what happens next. Every meaningful story reaches a moment where the main character must decide whether the future will be defined by past failures or present action. Families face that same decision every day. Perhaps that is why Father Ripperger repeatedly returns to one central idea. The battle for the family is never ultimately about perfection. It is about direction. Perfect families do not exist. Perfect parents do not exist. Perfect marriages do not exist. Every family experiences failures, conflicts, weaknesses, and setbacks. The difference lies in whether those failures become permanent patterns or temporary obstacles. Families grow stronger, not because they avoid every mistake, but because they continually return to what matters most. And that leads to one final question. Years from now, when future generations look back at this moment, what will they inherit from the choices being made today? Will they inherit confusion or clarity, passivity or courage, division or unity, indifference or conviction? The answer is being written right now in ordinary moments that seem unimportant while they are happening, because history is rarely changed by dramatic events alone. More often, it is changed by small decisions repeated consistently over time. That is the challenge at the heart of Father Ripperger's message. Not merely to identify what is wrong, but to build what is right. Not merely to recognize the dangers facing families, but to become the kind of people capable of resisting them. Because every strong family begins with someone deciding that comfort is no longer enough. Someone deciding that responsibility matters. Someone deciding that faith must become more than a label. Someone deciding that future generations are worth fighting for. And perhaps the most powerful part of all is this: the story is not finished. No matter how far a family has drifted, no matter how many mistakes have been made, no matter how much damage has already occurred, as long as people are willing to change, restoration remains possible. The next chapter has not been written yet. The future remains unwritten. And the choices made today may ultimately become the turning point that changes everything.